October 23, 1944. Philippine Sea, approximately 120 nautical miles east of Leyte Gulf. Captain Tameichi Hara stood on the bridge of the Yahagi, a light cruiser escorting a flotilla of Japanese destroyers bound for the decisive naval engagement that would soon be called the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Through his night vision binoculars, the darkness seemed absolute, the perfect blanket of concealment for their approach. His flotilla ran without lights, maintaining radio silence, invisible to any American forces in the region, or so he believed. Within 6 hours, Captain Hara's destroyers would be in disarray, scattered across 50 miles of ocean, their carefully planned night attack aborted. They would become victims of a technology they didn't fully comprehend. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The truth was, American radar, operators aboard the USS Nashville, had been tracking the Japanese flotilla for nearly 8 hours. From more than 50 miles away, microwave pulses invisible to human senses had been bouncing off Japanese hulls, returning with precise information about their location, course, speed, and composition. Operators watching oscilloscope screens saw not darkness, but clear, unmistakable signatures of enemy vessels attempting to achieve surprise. The darkness that Captain Hara trusted for concealment had become meaningless in the face of technological superiority. The psychological impact of this realization would ripple through the Japanese naval command, undermining confidence, shattering tactical assumptions, and accelerating the collapse of Japanese naval effectiveness. The oceans that once served as Japan's highways to empire had become transparent hunting grounds, where American technology rendered traditional concealment useless. The mathematics of this technological asymmetry are already being written across the Pacific in statistics that would obliterate every assumption Japanese surface commanders held about their capabilities, their tactics, and their chances of survival. Between 1941 and 1945, American forces would sink more than 300 Japanese destroyers and light cruisers, accounting for nearly 70% of Japan's surface combatant losses. The disparity wasn't just numerical. It represented a fundamental difference in how two nations approached naval warfare, industrial production, and technological innovation. While Japan built magnificent warships with superior torpedoes and night-fighting optics, America built radar systems that made night irrelevant. While Japanese engineers created vessels optimized for the limited visibility torpedo attacks at which they excelled, American factories produced microwave radar, proximity fuses, fire control computers, and combat information centers that transformed naval warfare from an art of visual combat to a science of electronic detection and precision firing beyond visual range. The transformation would begin not with a single dramatic moment, but through thousands of encounters where Japanese surface commanders gradually realized they were being tracked by forces they couldn't see, targeted with technologies they didn't understand, and systematically eliminated by an industrial machine of incomprehensible scale. Commander Toshio Abe, captain of the destroyer Shigure, would later tell American interrogators after his capture in 1945 that the moment he understood Japan had lost the war came not from any battle, but from studying American radar capabilities during his imprisonment. The seemingly supernatural ability of American forces to detect Japanese ships in darkness, through rain squalls, and at ranges exceeding the horizon, all pointed to capabilities Japan simply couldn't match. But for thousands of Japanese destroyer sailors, the realization came through direct, terrifying encounters with American radar-guided weaponry. Encounters that left survivors stunned and demoralized. The story of how Japanese destroyer crews came to understand American technological superiority is not one of dramatic fleet engagements or heroic last stands. It's a story of cumulative revelation, of gradual understanding, of technological shock so profound that it transformed confident warriors into men who knew their cause was hopeless long before their nation officially surrendered. The Japanese destroyer force that entered World War II in December 1941 was among the world's finest. Japan possessed approximately 112 destroyers, many of revolutionary design, The Fubuki-class destroyers, considered the world's most advanced when introduced in the 1920s, featured enclosed turrets, dual-purpose guns capable of engaging both surface and aerial targets, and the deadly Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, the finest naval torpedo in the world, with a range of 22 miles and a warhead twice the size of its American equivalent. The Kagero and Yugumo classes that followed were equally impressive, combining high speed, heavy armament, and superior night optics into vessels that excelled in the limited visibility torpedo attacks that became the signature of Japanese destroyer tactics. Each destroyer carried between 8 and 16 torpedoes in reload tubes, giving them devastating striking power against larger vessels. Their crews trained extensively in night combat, practiced torpedo attacks under realistic conditions, and understood their vessels intimately. Many had years of combat experience from operations in China. Captain Tameichi Hara, who would survive to become one of Japan's most decorated destroyer commanders, was considered among the finest surface warfare tacticians in any navy. His crews were disciplined, skilled, and confident. They had reason for confidence. In the early months of the war, Japanese destroyers participated successfully in operations throughout the Pacific, dominated night engagements, sank American cruisers and destroyers with minimal losses, and established tactical superiority in surface combat. The doctrine emphasized aggressive night attacks, using superior torpedoes to strike from beyond enemy gun range, crippling capital ships, and withdrawing before effective countermeasures could be implemented. Unlike American destroyers that initially focused on screening larger vessels and anti-submarine warfare, Japanese destroyers were offensive weapons, designed to deliver devastating torpedo strikes in darkness or limited visibility. This tactical focus would prove increasingly ineffective as American radar technology transformed naval warfare. While Japanese destroyers hunted by moonlight and starlight, American destroyers were developing the ability to see through darkness with perfect clarity. More importantly, Japanese emphasis on visual detection meant their forces encountered American radar-guided weaponry, primarily when it was too late to counter effectively. The first encounters with American radar occurred in 1942, but Japanese commanders often misinterpreted the technology's capabilities. Early American radar, operating at relatively low frequencies, had limited resolution and accuracy. Japanese commanders who survived engagements reported American forces firing somewhat randomly into darkness, occasionally achieving hits more through volume of fire than precision. This created a dangerous misperception that American radar was merely an incremental improvement over existing technology. By 1943, microwave radar had transformed American capabilities. The centimetric radar sets operating at frequencies above 3,000 MHz provided resolution and accuracy that earlier systems couldn't approach. These systems could detect destroyer-sized vessels at ranges exceeding 20 miles in good conditions, could track multiple targets simultaneously, and could provide firing solutions accurate enough to achieve first salvo hits in total darkness. Combined with the VT proximity fuse, introduced in 1943 for anti-aircraft shells and later adapted for surface warfare, American gunnery achieved an accuracy and lethality that shocked Japanese commanders. Previously, naval shells required direct hits to be effective against warships. The proximity fuse detonated shells when they came within optimum distance of their targets, making near misses as deadly as direct hits and multiplying the effectiveness of American gunnery. For Captain Tameichi Hara and the destroyer flotilla approaching Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the first indications something was wrong came when American cruisers opened fire from beyond visual range. Hara's lookouts had reported no enemy contacts. His radar operators, using Japan's primitive radar technology, detected nothing on their screens. Yet American shells were falling with disturbing accuracy around Japanese vessels, navigating in what they believed was perfect concealment. What happened next revealed the full extent of American radar superiority. As Japanese destroyers took evasive action, American fire control radar tracked their movements, adjusting firing solutions continuously. Proximity fuses detonated shells at optimal distance, showering Japanese decks with lethal fragments even when direct hits weren't achieved. Most devastating, American ships maintained fire control despite Japanese smokescreens and evasive maneuvers that would have broken visual contact completely. Commander Shoji Kawaguchi, aboard the destroyer Fujinami, reported what Japanese sailors called ghost fire, accurate shell fire emerging from darkness with no visible source. The psychological impact was profound. Japanese crews, trained to fight what they could, sea, found themselves hunted by enemies they couldn't detect, targeted by weapons that seemed to find them regardless of concealment or evasion. The disparity extended far beyond detection capability. American Combat Information Centers, CICs, represented integrated command systems unlike anything in Japanese vessels. Introduced in 1943, the CIC combined radar displays, plotting tables, communications equipment, and trained specialists into coordinated teams that processed tactical information with unprecedented speed and accuracy. American commanders received continuously updated tactical pictures, allowing decisions based on comprehensive information rather than limited visual observation. Japanese destroyers possessed nothing comparable. Information flowed through traditional channels, lookouts reporting to the bridge, signals between ships, radio communications when silence wasn't required. The result was fragmentary awareness, delayed decision-making, and increasing vulnerability to American forces operating with superior information advantage. Commander Toshio Abe, captured after his destroyer Shigura was sunk in 1945, later described the feeling to American interrogators as fighting an enemy that could see in the dark, knew your position before you knew theirs, and could deliver devastating fire before you realized you were detected. The paranoia wasn't unjustified. It was accurate assessment of reality. The industrial disparity manifested in ways that shocked Japanese naval officers who survived to see American facilities after surrender. While Japan struggled to maintain 100 operational destroyers throughout the war, America built over 350 destroyers between 1941 and 1945, replacing losses faster than combat could inflict them. American shipyards were producing destroyers at rates Japanese planners considered impossible. Bath Iron Works in Maine, Federal Shipbuilding in New Jersey, Boston Navy Yard in Massachusetts, and other facilities operated around the clock, launching Fletcher-class destroyers at intervals that Japanese yards couldn't approach. The destroyers themselves represented industrial capabilities beyond Japanese comprehension. American Fletcher and Sumner-class destroyers, while comparable in size to Japanese vessels, were produced with standardized components manufactured across dozens of factories. Engines, guns, electronics, fire control systems all flowed from separate facilities and arrived at assembly yards in perfectly coordinated streams. A single Fletcher-class destroyer required approximately 120,000 parts manufactured by contractors in 29 states. The supply chain never faltered. When destroyers needed repairs, spare parts were available immediately. When destroyers were lost, replacements arrived within months. Japanese destroyers damaged in combat often waited weeks or months for repairs due to parts shortages, maintenance facility overload, and industrial bottlenecks that American forces never experienced. The radar situation exemplified the technological and industrial gap. American destroyers carried the SG surface search radar with ranges exceeding 20 miles against destroyer-sized targets. They carried the Mark IV fire control radar that provided targeting data accurate to 50 yards at ranges of 5 miles. By 1944, American radar technology had evolved through 4 generations since the war began, each improvement increasing range, accuracy, and reliability. Japanese radar development lagged catastrophically. The Imperial Japanese Navy didn't issue its first radar sets until April 1942, nearly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. These early systems, operating at very high frequencies, had limited range and poor resolution. By late 1943, improved Japanese radar was beginning to appear on destroyers, but in limited quantities. and with performance still inferior to American systems from 1941. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This meant American destroyers could detect Japanese vessels long before they were detected in return, could track targets from beyond visual range, could position themselves for attacks with information advantages Japanese commanders couldn't counter. American destroyers also benefited from intelligence advantages that seemed supernatural to Japanese officers. American forces often knew Japanese movement schedules, patrol areas, and operational plans before Japanese commanders received their orders. Combined with radar and fire control superiority, this meant Japanese destroyers were operating in an ocean where the enemy knew where they were going, and possessed technology to track them with accuracy that seemed impossible. Captain Tameichi Hara later described the feeling in his memoirs as being constantly visible, constantly vulnerable, never concealed, even in darkest night or heaviest weather. The paranoia wasn't unjustified. It was accurate assessment of reality. The cumulative effect of these technological and industrial advantages created a mathematical inevitability that Japanese naval commanders gradually understood. Every engagement, every encounter, every narrow escape from American forces reinforced the same lesson. The ocean belonged to America now. Traditional Japanese advantages in night fighting, torpedo technology, and visual detection were rendered obsolete by radar, proximity fuzzes, and combat information centers. By 1945, Japanese destroyer operations had been reduced to desperate supply runs, suicide missions, and ultimately inaction as vessels remained in port, conserving dwindling fuel reserves and avoiding inevitable destruction at sea. For Japanese destroyer crews who survived to see American operations firsthand after surrender, the technological revelations were devastating. Captain Hara, who survived the war and witnessed American operations firsthand during occupation, later wrote that the technological gap had been wider than even pessimists in the Japanese Navy had believed. American destroyers possessed capabilities that made traditional Japanese tactics obsolete, operated with coordination Japanese forces couldn't achieve, and were produced in quantities that guaranteed American numerical superiority, regardless of combat losses. American examination of captured Japanese destroyers revealed both impressive engineering and critical weaknesses. The long-lance torpedo was acknowledged as superior to any American equivalent, but radar-guided gunnery made torpedo attacks increasingly difficult to execute effectively. Japanese optical equipment, particularly night binoculars, was superior to American equivalents, but became irrelevant when radar could see farther and with greater accuracy than any human eye. Japanese destroyers lacked the comprehensive fire control systems that made American destroyers so deadly. American destroyers used integrated fire control computers that automatically calculated firing solutions, accounting for target course, speed, range, and ballistic factors. Japanese destroyers relied on manual calculations that took longer, were more error-prone, and put vessels at greater risk during combat engagements. The technological gap wasn't subtle. It was profound and pervasive, affecting every aspect of destroyer operations. The human cost of this technological inferiority was staggering. Japan lost 88% of its destroyers during the war, representing the highest loss rate of any major warship type in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Of the 112 destroyers Japan possessed in December 1941, plus those built during the war, most were destroyed by American forces using the very technologies Japanese crews had come to fear: radar-guided gunnery, proximity fuses, coordinated air attacks, and systematic hunter-killer operations. Approximately 42,000 Japanese sailors aboard destroyers died during the war, a casualty rate exceeding 75%. Destroyer service, initially considered prestigious and honorable, became recognized as a death sentence by war's end. Young men assigned to destroyer duty understood they likely wouldn't survive. Families mourned sons departing for destroyer training, knowing the statistical odds. The Japanese destroyer force, which had entered the war with confidence and pride, ended the war as a broken arm of a defeated navy, its survivors demoralized, and its capabilities nullified by technological inferiority. The psychological transformation of Japanese destroyer crews mirrored the experience of German POWs in America, but followed a different path. Where German prisoners witnessed American abundance and prosperity directly, Japanese sailors experienced American technological superiority through lethal encounters at sea. Both groups reached the same conclusion through different evidence. Japan and Germany had challenged nations whose industrial and technological capabilities exceeded anything Axis powers could match. For Japanese naval officers who surrendered in August 1945, the evidence of American superiority was overwhelming and undeniable. They were brought aboard American vessels and shown technology they had never seen. They toured American naval facilities and witnessed production capabilities that explained why American forces never seemed to run short of anything. They saw the radar systems that had hunted them. They examined the proximity fuzzes that had made American gunfire so lethal. They studied the combat information centers that had coordinated American tactics with precision they couldn't match. Commander Shoji Kawaguchi, taken aboard USS Nicholas after surrendering in Tokyo Bay, was given a tour of the American destroyer by Lieutenant Commander Robert Wilkinson. Kawaguchi examined Nicholas's radar systems, her CIC, her fire control computer, her anti-aircraft batteries. Everything was more advanced than equivalent Japanese systems. More importantly, everything worked reliably. Equipment didn't break down, systems functioned as designed. American sailors operated their ship with casual confidence that came from knowing their technology was superior and their support was guaranteed. Japanese destroyer crews had no equivalent confidence. They operated knowing American technology could find them, track them, kill them. The psychological burden was immense. Kawaguchi later told interrogators that the moment he understood Japan had lost wasn't when he heard of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but months earlier when his destroyer was illuminated by star shells at night, then engaged with radar-guided gunfire of impossible accuracy from American vessels his lookouts couldn't see. The evidence continued to accumulate during the months after surrender. Japanese naval officers were brought to American bases in Japan, to Pearl Harbor, where captured vessels were studied, to San Diego, where American destroyer production continued despite the war's end. Rear Admiral Masaki Owada, commander of Destroyer Squadron 2, made a point of studying American radar technology during his cooperation with occupation authorities. The knowledge would later influence Japan's post-war naval development when he became an advisor to the newly formed Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. The lessons learned by Japanese destroyer crews spread through post-war Japan as survivors returned home and shared their experiences. Many wrote memoirs describing their shock at American technological capabilities. Others gave lectures to Japanese self-defense force personnel about the importance of technological parity in modern warfare. The naval veterans associations that formed in the 1950s and 1960s focused heavily on understanding what had gone wrong, why Japan's once proud destroyer force had achieved so little despite impressive engineering and courage. The conclusions were unanimous: technological inferiority, industrial weakness, and strategic miscalculation had doomed Japanese naval forces from the start. No amount of courage, skill, or determination could overcome the fundamental asymmetry in capabilities. American destroyers operated with technological advantages at every level: detection, fire control, communication, coordination, and logistics. Japanese destroyers, regardless of how well designed or skillfully operated, were fighting from positions of permanent disadvantage. The destroyer veterans who learned this lesson carried it into Japan's post-war reconstruction, influencing industrial policy, technological development, and military planning for decades. The economic miracle that transformed Japan in the 1950s and 1960s was partly informed by lessons learned during the war. Japanese industry focused on technological excellence, quality control, and competitive advantage rather than size or spectacle. The emphasis shifted from creating impressive individual achievements to building integrated systems that worked reliably. Sony, Toyota, Honda, and other Japanese companies that became global leaders learned from military failures during the war. They understood that technological superiority required not just good ideas, but complete systems, reliable production, quality assurance, and continuous improvement. Former Japanese naval officers, including destroyer veterans, took positions in these companies and influenced their development. The lessons of American technological superiority during the war shaped post-war Japanese industrial philosophy. The transformation was complete when Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, destroyers, began incorporating American radar technology in the 1960s and 1970s. Japanese naval officers trained with American instructors, learned American tactics, used American radar systems, and operated ships designed with American assistance. The former enemies became allies, united by recognition that technological excellence and industrial capacity determined outcomes in modern warfare. For Japanese destroyer veterans who had experienced the war, this transformation vindicated their post-war assessment. Japan needed to match American technological capabilities, not just admire them from a position of inferiority. By the 1980s, Japan's destroyers were among the world's finest, incorporating lessons learned through painful defeat. The story of Japanese destroyer crews detecting American radar pulses and realizing they'd been tracked all night is ultimately a story about technological change in warfare. Superior technology deployed, industrial capacity trumped courage, skill, and determination. Japanese destroyer crews were not cowards. They were not incompetent. They were operating with inadequate technology against forces possessing decisive advantages. The psychological impact on Japanese naval personnel extended far beyond tactical defeat. It reached into the realm of existential crisis as they confronted not just military loss, but fundamental questions about Japan's place in the technological world. Lieutenant Masanobu Ikari, a destroyer communications officer who survived the Battle of Surigao Strait, described in his post-war memoir how the defeat transformed his worldview. He wrote, "I believed technology was merely a tool that superior fighting spirit could overcome. After watching American radar-guided shells find us in pitch darkness, I understood technology wasn't just a tool, it was destiny." This revelation rippled through the Japanese military hierarchy, creating cognitive dissonance that few could reconcile with Japan's cultural narrative. The nation that had modernized so rapidly during the Meiji era, that had defeated Russia in 1905, shocking the Western world, now found itself hopelessly outclassed in the technological realm. Admiral Matomi Ugaki, one of Japan's most respected naval commanders, wrote in his diary in early 1945, "We have courage in abundance. What we lack are the eyes to see through darkness and the industrial capacity to build those eyes in sufficient numbers." The irony was particularly bitter because Japan had not ignored radar technology. Japanese scientists had been developing radar systems since 1936. Dr. Yoji Ito at the Naval Technical Research Institute had created functioning prototype systems before the war began. But critical miscalculations in prioritization, resources, and implementation had left Japan years behind American development, where American military and industrial planners recognized radar's transformative potential immediately. Japanese naval leadership viewed it as merely supplementary to traditional methods. This failure of imagination had catastrophic consequences. By the time Japanese naval authorities recognized radar's decisive importance in 1943, the industrial capacity to produce advanced systems in quantity no longer existed. American bombing had crippled Japan's electronic manufacturing capabilities. Critical materials were unavailable due to submarine blockade. The engineers needed to design and implement production systems were increasingly drafted for frontline service as Japan's manpower reserves dwindled. Commander Masatake Okumiya, who served on the Imperial Navy General Staff late in the war, later reflected, "Our greatest failure wasn't technological, but conceptual. We didn't lack the scientific knowledge to develop radar. We lacked the vision to understand how it would transform warfare, and the industrial planning to implement that vision. This conceptual failure cascaded through Japan's entire approach to naval warfare, from tactical doctrine to ship design to training regimens. The human dimension of this technological disparity manifested in deeply personal ways for Japanese destroyer crews. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto, a damage control officer aboard the destroyer Arashi, described the psychological toll in testimony recorded by American intelligence officers. After Leyte Gulf, we knew we were being hunted by an unseen eye. Every radar-equipped plane, every American warship carried this supernatural vision that rendered our darkness training useless. We'd practiced for years to fight in conditions where neither side could see clearly. Suddenly one side could see perfectly while we remained blind. This asymmetry created a unique form of combat stress among Japanese naval personnel. Traditional naval warfare had always contained elements of chance, of mutual vulnerability, of equal risk. Radar eliminated this equality, creating a one-sided engagement environment where Japanese crews operated in constant knowledge of their technological disadvantage. They couldn't strike what they couldn't detect. They couldn't evade what could track them with precision. The psychological effect was devastating. Medical officers aboard Japanese destroyers reported increasing cases of combat fatigue, anxiety disorders, and depression among crews. Conditions the Imperial Navy had rarely acknowledged before 1944. Captain Toshihiro Inaguchi, who commanded Destroyer Squadron 7, wrote in his final report before his death at Leyte Gulf, "Our men fight with the courage of samurai, but even samurai cannot defeat an enemy who strikes from beyond the range of our swords, who sees us when we cannot see them, who knows our position when we know nothing of theirs." The technological gap manifested most tragically during radar-guided night actions. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in August 1943 provided a devastating demonstration. An American destroyer division, commanded by Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, ambushed a Japanese destroyer transportation group attempting to reinforce New Georgia. Using SG radar, the American destroyers tracked the Japanese formation from beyond visual range, maneuvered to perfect firing position, and launched torpedoes before the Japanese were aware of their presence. 3 Japanese destroyers, Arashi, Hagikaze, and Kawakaze, were sunk within minutes, without landing a single hit on American vessels. Only the Shigure escaped. Commander Tameichi Hara, commanding Shigure, later described the experience. "It was as if we had entered a shooting gallery, with ourselves as the targets. They saw us perfectly while we stumbled in blindness. This wasn't naval combat as we understood it, it was execution." The Taffy 3 engagement off Samar provided another stark illustration. When Admiral Kurita's center force surprised American escort carriers, the mismatch in firepower seemed to guarantee Japanese victory. Yet American destroyer escorts, though hopelessly outgunned, used radar fire control to land hits on Japanese heavy cruisers from ranges that Japanese gunners couldn't match with optical fire control. The smaller American vessels inflicted critical damage while maneuvering with information superiority that their Japanese opponents couldn't counter. Even more devastating was the night action in Surigao Strait during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's battle line, guided by radar, crossed the T of the approaching Japanese formation under Admiral Nishimura. The result was the most lopsided surface engagement of the war. American battleships and cruisers, firing radar-guided salvos in total darkness, systematically destroyed Japanese vessels that couldn't effectively return fire due to inability to locate targets accurately. Lieutenant Miyake Yoshimasa, one of only a handful of survivors from the battleship Yamashiro, described the experience. "We were being hit by invisible shells from an invisible enemy. Our lookouts saw nothing. Our gunners had no targets. Yet American shells found us with supernatural accuracy. It wasn't combat. It was slaughter." The Japanese Southern Force lost 2 battleships, 3 destroyers, and a heavy cruiser, while inflicting 0 casualties on American vessels. The technological disparity had rendered traditional naval combat obsolete. The radar gap wasn't limited to surface engagements. American airborne radar transformed anti-shipping operations equally dramatically. The ASB Airborne Surface Search Radar allowed American aircraft to locate Japanese vessels in darkness or bad weather conditions that would have prevented visual detection. Combined with advances in night fighter tactics and technology, this meant Japanese ships had no safe time to move, no weather conditions that guaranteed concealment. Lieutenant Sadao Chigusa, who survived the sinking of the destroyer Uranami by radar-equipped American aircraft in October 1944, described how this capability shocked Japanese sailors. "We were taught that night and bad weather were our allies, that American pilots couldn't find targets they couldn't see. Then came the night attacks, the planes that found us in storm conditions, the bombs that fell from clouds we thought protected us. We realized our teachers had no understanding of what we faced." The industrial context that produced this technological disparity was equally shocking to Japanese naval personnel. Commander Yasumasa Matsuyama visited American naval facilities as part of the Japanese surrender delegation. His report to the remaining naval staff described manufacturing capabilities that seemed almost mythological. "The Americans could produce in one day what took our yards a month. Their quality control exceeds our most rigorous standards. Their standardization allows interchangeability we never achieved. Most devastating, they consider obsolete technology we viewed as advanced." This industrial gulf had personal implications for Japanese sailors. American destroyers operated with abundance, ammunition expenditure rates that Japanese commanders could only dream of, fuel consumption patterns unconstrained by scarcity, maintenance schedules supported by plentiful spare parts. Japanese destroyers increasingly operated with critical shortages of everything, from ammunition to fuel to replacement components. By 1945, Japanese destroyer operations were constrained more by resource limitations than by tactical considerations. Fuel shortages kept vessels in port. Ammunition shortages limited training exercises. Maintenance backlogs grew as parts became unobtainable. Captain Masayoshi Ogura, who commanded the destroyer Kamikaze during the final months of the war, described the psychological impact. "Our men understood the technological disadvantage, but the material shortages broke their spirit. A sailor can face superior weapons with courage. When he cannot obtain basic necessities to maintain his ship, courage becomes meaningless." The human dimension of technological defeat created profound disillusionment among Japanese naval personnel. Many had entered service believing in Japanese technological prowess, having been raised with stories of how Japan had modernized faster than any other Asian nation, how Japanese industry produced ships the Western powers admired, how Japanese weapons represented the perfect blend of traditional craftsmanship and modern science. The reality of American radar superiority shattered these beliefs. Ensign Takashi Miyazaki, a young radar operator aboard the destroyer Fujinami, wrote in his final letter home before dying at Leyte Gulf, "I operate our radar set faithfully, but it is like comparing a candle to the sun." The American radar sees through darkness, through storms, through smoke. Ours barely functions beyond visual range. I have maintained my equipment with all my skill, but the fault lies not in maintenance but in fundamental capability. The psychological transformation extended beyond military effectiveness into questions of national identity and cultural values. Lieutenant Commander Hiroaki Abe, who survived the war to become a prominent naval historian, described in his memoirs how technological defeat forced painful reassessment. "We had built our national narrative around the fusion of traditional Japanese spirit with modern technology. American radar superiority revealed that our understanding of modern technology was fundamentally flawed. We believed we had caught the Western powers. The radar gap showed how far behind we truly were." This realization didn't emerge from abstract analysis, but from concrete, lethal experiences that accumulated across thousands of engagements. Each radar-guided shell that found, its mark in darkness, each torpedo that tracked a Japanese ship invisible to its launchers, each aircraft that appeared over a Japanese convoy in weather that should have precluded aerial observation, all contributed to a growing understanding that technological inferiority had made traditional Japanese naval excellence irrelevant. The awareness didn't manifest as immediate capitulation. Japanese destroyer crews continued fighting with extraordinary courage even after recognizing their technological disadvantage. The 10 destroyers that participated in Operation Tengo, the final sortie of the battleship Yamato in April 1945, knew they faced certain destruction. Yet they sailed knowingly into American radar coverage, facing aircraft guided by technology they couldn't counter, accepting death with a fatalism born of technological realism rather than spiritual belief. Captain Tameichi Hara, who survived the war to document this psychological journey, described the final phase as fighting without hope but with perfect clarity. Japanese destroyer crews by early 1945 understood precisely what they faced: an opponent who could see them in any conditions, track them with perfect accuracy, and deliver overwhelming firepower guided by technology they couldn't match. They fought not with the expectation of victory, but from duty, from solidarity with comrades, from the human drive to maintain dignity in defeat. This clarity had political implications that military historians often overlook. The Japanese Naval Officer Corps, particularly destroyer commanders who had experienced American radar superiority directly, became some of the strongest advocates for surrender within military circles. They understood, in ways that army officers and civilian leadership often didn't, that technological defeat wasn't temporary or reversible. The gap would only widen as American production accelerated and Japanese capacity diminished. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, whose diary provides crucial insights into Japanese naval thinking, wrote in June 1945, "Our destroyer captains report American radar capabilities that exceed our most pessimistic assessments. If they can find us in darkness from 50 miles, track us through any evasive maneuver, and deliver fire with first salvo accuracy, how can we execute any operational plan successfully? The technological disparity has rendered traditional naval warfare impossible for our forces." The lessons Japanese naval personnel drew from this experience profoundly influenced post-war Japan. The officers who survived, men like Hara, Abe, and Masatake Okumiya, became voices for technological emphasis in Japan's reconstruction. They understood that national security and economic prosperity required technological parity with advanced nations, particularly in electronics, sensing systems, and information processing, precisely the areas where wartime disparities had been most pronounced. Their influence extended far beyond military affairs. When Sony founder Masaru Ibuka recruited talent for his fledgling electronics company in the late 1940s, he specifically sought former naval officers who had experienced American technological superiority firsthand. He recognized that these men possessed not just technical knowledge but psychological motivation, the determination never again to fall behind in critical technologies. Similarly, when Toyota expanded its quality control systems in the 1950s, former naval personnel who had witnessed American industrial capacity played key roles in developing processes that would eventually surpass American standards. The bitter lessons of technological inferiority became driving forces in Japan's economic miracle, transforming defeat into determination to achieve parity and then superiority in key industrial sectors. The story contains particular resonance because radar, the technology that most clearly demonstrated the capability gap, became one of Japan's areas of greatest post-war strength. Japanese electronics firms developed radar systems that eventually set global standards. The nation that had fallen catastrophically behind in radar technology during the war became a leader in the field within 30 years of surrender. Producing systems for maritime safety, weather monitoring, and defense that customers worldwide sought for their reliability and advanced capabilities. This transformation wasn't coincidental. It represented deliberate application of painful lessons learned through defeat. Lieutenant Ichiro Tanaka, who served as a communications officer aboard the destroyer Yukikaze, one of only 2 Japanese destroyers to survive the entire war from Pearl Harbor to surrender. Later became an electronics engineer at Mitsubishi. He described his motivation. "Every day in my laboratory, I remembered American radar that could see through darkness when our best optical systems saw nothing. I dedicated my career to ensuring Japanese technology would never again fall so far behind." The human dimension of this technological reawakening is perhaps the most powerful aspect of the story. Men who had faced American radar-guided destruction, who had watched comrades die in engagements where technological disparity rendered courage and skill irrelevant, channeled that experience not into bitterness, but into determination. They rebuilt their nation around technological excellence, precisely because they had experienced its absence so painfully. Commander Iwao Matsuda, who survived multiple radar-guided attacks on his destroyer before its sinking in 1944, later told American naval historians, "We never hated the technology that defeated us. We respected it, studied it, and vowed to master it ourselves." The American radar pulses that found us in darkness became the guideposts for Japan's future, showing us the technological path we needed to follow. This perspective helps explain why the partnership between American and Japanese naval forces developed so rapidly and effectively during the Cold War. Former adversaries who had experienced the technological gap firsthand recognized the value of alliance with the nation that had developed the systems that defeated them. Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force officers, many of whom had served in the Imperial Navy, approached cooperation with American forces not as humiliation but as opportunity for technological learning and advancement. The rapidity of this transition from mortal enemies to close allies puzzled many observers. But for Japanese naval personnel who had experienced American radar superiority, the alliance represented acknowledgement of technological reality rather than political capitulation. They had seen the future of warfare revealed in American radar pulses, penetrating darkness, and they understood that Japan's security required access to this technology, rather than resistance to it. The final irony emerged in the 1980s, when Japanese electronics firms began supplying components for American radar systems, including military applications. The nation that had fallen fatally behind in radar technology during World War II had not only achieved parity, but in many areas surpassed the capabilities of the country that had once used that technology to defeat them. Former Imperial Navy officers who had survived to witness this transformation described it as vindication of Japan's post-war technological emphasis. Captain Tameichi Hara, writing in 1984, shortly before his death, reflected, "When I stood on my destroyer bridge in 1944 and watched American shells find us in perfect darkness, I couldn't have imagined that Japanese firms would someday build the world's most advanced sensing systems." Yet this transformation represents perfect symmetry. We learned through defeat what technologies truly matter, and we rebuilt our nation around mastering them. The story of Japanese destroyer crews detecting American radar pulses and realizing they were being tracked all night resonates beyond military history. It represents a profound human truth, that technological advantage, when sufficiently decisive, transforms warfare from contest of courage to mathematical inevitability. The Japanese sailors who experienced this transformation firsthand carried its lessons into peace, rebuilding their nation around technological excellence precisely because they had witnessed its absence so catastrophically. Their journey from confidence to defeat to transformation mirrors Japan's national experience, condensed into the microcosm of destroyer warfare. The technological shock they experienced as American radar pulses revealed their positions in darkness became the catalyst for national reinvention, focused on technical education, electronic manufacturing, and quality control systems that would eventually make Made in Japan a global mark of excellence rather than inferiority. The ocean that Japanese destroyers once roamed with confidence became an American domain through technology and industry. Radar swept the darkness, revealing vessels that believed themselves concealed. Fire control computers calculated precise firing solutions against targets that couldn't effectively return fire. Proximity phases detonated shells at optimum distance even when direct hits weren't achieved. Combat information centers coordinated operations with information superiority that transformed naval warfare from art to science. The transformation was complete by mid-1945, leaving Japanese destroyers with nowhere to hide, no tactical advantage to exploit, no hope of survival. When Admiral Moosbrugger's destroyer division ambushed Japanese reinforcement convoys in Leyte Gulf, using radar to locate targets, maneuver for perfect firing position, and launch torpedoes before being detected, the psychological defeat of Japanese surface forces was complete. If American destroyers could locate and destroy Japanese vessels with impunity in darkness, then Japanese naval doctrine was finished. The ocean belonged to those who controlled the technology. Japanese destroyer crews understood this lesson viscerally. They had been tracked, targeted, and destroyed by technologies they couldn't see and couldn't counter. Those who survived carried the knowledge that Japan's defeat was inevitable once American technological superiority manifested fully. The ocean had never truly been Japan's. It had only taken time for reality to assert itself. American radar, proximity fuses, fire control computers, and industrial capacity had transformed naval warfare. Japanese destroyer crews, regardless of their skill or courage, were operating in an environment where the enemy possessed decisive technological advantages. The realization came gradually through accumulated encounters, narrow escapes, and reports from other vessels. By 1945, it was universal among survivors. The ocean was no longer theirs. It belonged to the nation that built the technology to control it. America had won the surface war not through superior seamanship, but through superior science, engineering, and industrial capacity. The legacy endures in modern naval warfare. Radar remains fundamental to maritime operations. Combat information centers are standard in warships worldwide. Electronic warfare capabilities determine combat outcomes more decisively than gun caliber or armor thickness. The technological revolution that shocked Japanese destroyer crews in 1944 continues evolving, with modern vessels using capabilities that would astound both American and Japanese forces from World War II. But the fundamental lesson remains unchanged. Technological superiority, backed by industrial capacity, determines outcomes in modern warfare. Japanese destroyer crews learned this, a lesson through defeat. They carried it into post-war reconstruction. They influenced Japanese industrial development and military planning for generations. The story of Japanese destroyer crews detecting American radar pulses and realizing they'd been tracked all night stands as testament to technological change in warfare and to human resilience in transforming defeat into determination. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.